Sanbonani, welcome back. This is Power Talk with me, Mbuyisen Ndlozi, on Power 987. It is our feature, as indicated earlier, political schools. And we are marking the 70th anniversary of the Freedom Charter. I'm joined by a couple of our listeners here who I'd like to welcome warmly, and thank you very much for coming through. Some of them are serious people in society, and we are also joined by the veteran to be part of the audience, by the way, Obabu Mavus Msimang, and we'll see if he's enough by our guests' input. You can obviously join the conversation on 0861987000. Send your voice notes 0833037093, and you can also watch. We are broadcasting live on our YouTube platform, and as I said, this is political schools. The Freedom Charter, which was passed in 1955, is turning exactly 70 years this year. The day is tomorrow, and we thought we should lay a foundation for a broader discussion about the inheritance that it truly carries. It was a very important conversation that involved over 3,000 people from all walks of life in Kliptown in 1955. I don't know if there's been anything of that nature since 1955, but certainly ours is now a democracy, and the other day there was 30 years of the setting up of the Constitutional Court, and I was wondering, how was it set up before the Constitution was adopted in 1996? But certainly it's a milestone, and I've got here, he's my brother and very close friend, and if I should gossip a bit with all of you, he won't like it, but you can offend a friend. Part of a certain demise of mine somewhere in my other life, Tembeka was used as evidence that he was cited as a very important evidence. I don't think he's aware, but he's here, and he's certainly one of the most important intellectuals in our country before he's a lawyer. And he comes from a very rich history of student activism. He may be going around with gowns in courts there, but he was a very radical student activist in the University of Transkei. If you think Mcebo is radical, you should have seen him when he was young. And you all know him as an advocate. I've asked him today to come with the entire intellectual power to give us a quick lecture and then engage with him thereafter. You can call in. We've got an audience here. We've got a roving mic. 70 years of the Freedom Charter and constitutional supremacy, the heritage of all of that. I've got and I'm going to now allow him with a round of applause from all of us and invite him to come and give his input. Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi.
Ndiyabulela Gqirha Lwazi Ndlozi. Ezinye andizozingena because njengobusitsho andizazi. So xa into ungazazi funeka uzigcine phakathi kulaa nto uba awuzazi. Thank you very much, Dr. Ndlozi. I haven't actually publicly congratulated you. I think I've written on social media congratulating you on this impressive achievement of moving from Parliament to Power FM. So you've now truly attained power. But from what I have been told, and I've also listened to snippets of your show, you're doing a great job empowering South Africans not just with entertainment, but with education. I have a little bit of history in radio. Most people don't know, but I was a founder of the then University of Transkei Community Radio. We call it today UCR-FM. But our name for it, those of us who were in SASCO, was Unicora. We lost out to the Model Cs, who called it UCR-FM. But we debated at length about the vision of a community radio station when we were drafting the Constitution. Others saying it should primarily be about entertainment, but I was among those who argued that it should be about education. I still believe radio should be about education, first and foremost. Entertainment should be a secondary goal, but I don't know how they will make money, but I think you are playing that role of fulfilling our vision at UCR-FM in the exciting years of the mid-1990s when I was as a student leader in SASCO. You have invited me to speak about the topic of constitutional supremacy versus parliamentary supremacy, but in the context of the Freedom Charter, and to try and finish that in 20 minutes. So I'm going to start now. I just want to make sure that I don't do what my other colleagues do, which is to speak beyond my allocated time. Just to first reflect on the Freedom Charter itself, I've just written a piece for the Sowetan reflecting on the origins of the Freedom Charter. And the primary argument I've tried to make in that piece is to go back to the origins of the Charter. There is a lot of misconception that the Charter was a product of a few white communists who had infiltrated the ANC and took over the sort of intellectual product and output of the Charter. But what is little known is that the Charter is actually a product of Professor Z.K. Matthews, an African man. He conceived of the Charter in 1953. The Charter itself was adopted in 1955. But in 1953, Z.K. Matthews was the president of the ANC in the Cape. And the conference, the national conference, I think was held in September in Cradock. Cradock is now back in the news because of the inquest. And in the closing address, he stated there, I have the quote, he stated that the time had come for South Africa to convene a Congress of the People. The word Congress of the People came from that speech, in which a Freedom Charter, even the word Freedom Charter, came from that speech, in which a Freedom Charter would be discussed and adopted. Now, that Freedom Charter was intended to be a mechanism for a non-racial future of South Africa. So this is the actual quote. The actual quote says, this is the quote of the resolution, which says that the conference notes with interest the remarks of the president, and the president was Z.K. Matthews, on the need for the establishment, at the instance of the African National Congress and under its leadership, of a Congress of the People in South Africa, to draw up inter alia a Freedom Charter or Constitution embodying a vision of the future as we in Congress see it. Such a Congress of the People would serve to unite all democratic forces in South Africa among all races into a front against the dangers of fascism. So this is Matthews speaking in 1953. That resolution was then taken up to the national ANC. It went to Chief Albert Luthuli, who was the then president of the ANC. Chief Luthuli then asked Z.K. Matthews for a memorandum that spells out how this Freedom Charter would be conceived. I have not seen the memorandum yet, but I've seen its summary in a book on the life of Z.K. prepared by Monica Wilson. Monica was a lecturer at Forte between 1944 and 1946 when Z.K. Matthews was a professor of anthropology. In other words, Monica reported to Z.K. Matthews. But the summary of it was to try and set out a vision of how the government would be constituted. In other words, a government that would be based on the will of the people. It also would set out how the economy would be structured in a future South Africa. In other words, an economy that transcends the racial oligarchy of apartheid. It also set out how the land would be shared among those who work it. This was then presented to the Congress of Democrats and the Indian Congress as an idea. Most of it, except item 12, and item 12 really comprised of the mechanics of how the charter would function. Most of it was adopted by both the Congress of Democrats and the Natal and Transvaal Indian Congress. And so already they achieved the first goal of uniting all of the democratic forces against the racial oligarchy of the National Party. But of course, the ANC had this legacy of being an Africanist party, because whites had not been allowed to join the African National Congress for a long time. But they allowed whites to attend the Kliptown Conference. At the time it was still called the Kliptown Conference in June of 1955, and they contributed. Z.K. Matthews himself did not attend the conference in June 1955. What had happened is that there was a student protest at Forte, and at the time he was the principal of the University of Forte. Matthews was an impressive figure himself. He had qualifications in law and anthropology, a BA, an LLB, an MA, and he had studied both at Yale University and at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he also had an impressive list of students, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. Those were some of his students. And Monica Wilson, in other words, talking about the inspiration of Matthews, also had an impressive list of students. Archie Mafeje was one of the students. Godfrey Piche was another. And so was Dumanokwe. We know Godfrey Piche and Dumanokwe subsequently became lawyers. Archie Mafeje became a well-renowned political scientist and anthropologist, ultimately meeting his demise when he had returned to South Africa and having obtained qualifications at Cambridge University. So we're talking about a man who had immense influence across. If you were alive in 1955, you would have been shocked to hear that the Freedom Charter was a communist document conceived and written by white communists that had infiltrated the intellectual thinking of the ANC. So today, in part, we have to pay homage to the real inspiration behind the Charter and the person who thought of it and designed it and laid the blueprint. it's Professor Z.K. Matthews. He was a black man. There is a tendency, Dr. Ndlozi, in this country to abandon our intellectual legacy in favor of assigning it to Eurocentrism and whiteness. But it's actually false historically when you trawl through the records and you find that most of these ideas came from black people. Why would whites anyway design or conceive of these ideas? Because white racism suited them. And so the people that would have been behind notions of non-racialism naturally would have been African people. So that's the first thing I just wanted to highlight on a note of historical correction. I do want to come back to what I have been asked to speak about. The opening words of the Charter is "We the people." We the people. I mean, that phrase, even now, it's 70 years after the Charter, but every time you read it, it still gives you goosebumps in terms of the power of the words, because it thereafter says, "We declare for the world to know that no government can be legitimate unless it is based on the will of the people." This is such a powerful thing. So the first important aspect of the Charter was the idea that the government would be based on the will of the people, and there will be no legitimate government unless it is based on the will of the people. Now you can imagine this was happening in 1955. And 1955 is only 7 years after D.F. Malone entered the National Party into power. And they are implementing the most aggressive racial laws. Separate Amenities Act, 1951. The Voter Registration Act, 1953. So this is the period in which the apartheid racism is being translated from politics to law. And so the people that then convene in Kliptown are basically signing their own death warrants. This is because at the time, if you proclaimed the views of the Freedom Charter, you were assigning yourself to death. And Z.K. Matthews was subsequently arrested in 1956, and he spent 135 years in detention, 35 days in detention. And he was acquitted in a famous trial called the Treason Trial, which we must distinguish from the Rivonia trial, where Mandela and others were found guilty. But he was acquitted in the Treason Trial, and he had the star witness. And it's in that Treason Trial that he articulated the vision behind the Freedom Charter. And specifically, the charge was that the Freedom Charter was a communist document. And he said, "I'm actually shocked that you regard this as a communist document because it's an extension of the non-racial traditions of the ANC from the 1923 Bill of Rights to the 1943 African Claims document. It's an extension, it's more expansive than those documents, but it's an extension of what the ANC has stood for since 1912, when he did not believe that it was an illegal organization to be disbanded." Anyway, that testimony is really one of the best reads available, the testimony of Z.K. Matthews in the 1956 Treason Trial. Anyway, they were acquitted. Rumpf gave a judgment in which he said he could not find that the charter was either a communist document or that the drafters behind the charter had any desires to violently overthrow the state. All right, so what about constitutional supremacy and parliamentary supremacy? I need to first define the terms. When we talk about constitutional supremacy, we mean a state where the rule of law is supreme, where the Constitution is supreme, where the Bill of Rights is supreme, where there is an independent judiciary which has the final word on the meaning of the law in the country. So that is what we understand by constitutional supremacy. That is what our Constitution embodies. And incidentally, that is what the previous ANC documents, 1923 Bill of Rights, 1943 Africans Claims, and the Charter itself always desired to have an independent judiciary that would interpret and apply the laws. By contrast, when we debate parliamentary supremacy, sometimes it's mistakenly called parliamentary sovereignty, but there is really nothing like sovereignty of parliament, because sovereign is the nation as a whole. It's really parliamentary supremacy that people are talking about. What we mean there is where parliament is supreme, where parliament can overturn a judgment of a court, where parliament's words on policy, on law is final, where parliament can change the constitution if it wishes, where the courts cannot question what parliament has decided, at least not on substantive ground, where the power of judicial review is limited only to procedure. So those are the two basic concepts that we are dealing with. So why does this distinction matter? I mean, firstly, just a point of history about these terms. There is a book by Professor Bernard Manning called Principles of Representative Government, published in 1997 by Cambridge University Press. What he does is a very useful study of this concept of sort of parliamentary democracy, because in a sense, what he tries to do is to unpack it and say, actually, it's a myth to talk of parliamentary democracy, because parliamentary representation is in conflict with democracy. So and the first thing he shows is that democracy itself functions on largely two models. The one model of democracy is a direct democracy model, and he traces that all the way from Athens in Greece. So you went to a constituency of the people, you made a decision by vote, and that was then the decision. Or if you couldn't make a decision by vote, you went to a lottery, and that was the decision. So that's like direct democracy. And then he says there is also a delegate model of democracy. So in other words, we don't make the decision ourselves. We send Dr. Ndlozi, go and make the decision on our behalf. But we tell him that he has no right to exercise independent judgment. Right? He must do what we tell him. So he's like there on a robotic mission. That's a delegate model, right? Which is distinguishable from a direct democracy model where the decision is made by the people. And then Professor Manning then makes this useful intervention for our purposes, which is that neither the delegate model nor the direct model are a reflection of today's conception of what we call democracy. Right? Because now what we have is representative democracy. And he says that the way that emerged from history was that the elites felt that they had lost power through the direct model and the delegate model. And it emerged as a consequence of a struggle between the elites and the people. Right? Because the elites wanted to represent the people without the constraints of democracy. Right? And so what they developed is what we call republicanism. So today we have a republican democracy in which people like Ndlozi do not actually tell us what they're going to debate on the VAT, for instance. We just learn when they have debated, right, that this is the position they've taken on VAT. They don't tell us what they will decide on the composition of the SABC board. They don't even come to take a mandate from us. Right? And so that is not democracy. That is not a sort of delegate model of democracy. It's a republican form of democracy in which the real power is actually among the parliamentarians. So we elect them once and then we see them again in 5 years' time. So that's a very useful way of understanding the sort of historical genesis of this. So when people tell us today that they want parliamentary supremacy, we ought to be taking a step back and asking, what actually do you want? So concentration of power among the parliamentarians, or are you really talking about a form of democracy? In South Africa, the theoretical articulation of this has been made by Arthur Charles Carson in one of the judgments of the Constitutional Court. And then when he says that what happens in South Africa, we don't have a direct democratic system, we don't have a delegate model system. We have a combination of a republican model and a party model. In other words, what the parliamentarians reflect is really a decision of the party. And the party nominates our representatives to Parliament. And the parliamentarians may be removed by the party, and the party achieves legitimacy because it obtains a vote through the manifesto that it presents to the public. So where we are in South Africa, we then have a combination of a party system and a Republican model, right, in which parliamentarians have a real power, and that real power is not exercised in conjunction with us. Right? So they have a loose mandate. They don't have a direct mandate. They have a loose mandate to improve the lives of South Africans, but they don't have a direct mandate that on a particular topic, this is how they will vote. They just decide on themselves how to vote. And then the specific instructions are given by the party. Right? Now, we can then make, and I want to go to the third topic before I sit down. I think I'll probably spend a minute or so. We can then make a determination about whether in South Africa we prefer a parliamentary model in which all power vests among the parliamentarians, or whether we prefer a constitutional model in which there is limited power that is vested on the parliamentarians. I just want to make a few examples to illustrate the dangers of this so-called parliamentary model, which has become in vogue these days. Robert Sobukwe was detained in 1960, and he was sent to prison in September. That's when he lost his appeal, September 1960, because of Sharpeville. In April 1963, he should have been released. In fact, he was meant to be released, and he was in detention in Pretoria, at the Pretoria Central Prison. At night before his release, a document was prepared by the state legal advisor to the Minister of Justice to say that Sobukwe needs to be transferred from Pretoria Central to Robben Island. And then a law needs to be changed to allow the Minister of Justice to extend the period of detention of any detainee to a period that the minister may decide. And then on the evening of the 3rd of April 1963, they transferred Sobukwe to Robben Island. And then in the morning of the 4th of April, they announced publicly that his detention had been extended on the powers vested in the minister. But that detention had to be presented to Parliament for extension. And they also wrote in that law that there is no court that has the power to question the decision of Parliament and the minister. That was called an ouster provision, which then meant that Sobukwe could not go to court and challenge the unfairness of the detention. That's one example of an absolute parliamentary system. The second one is the Terrorism Act. It's the so-called Suppression of Terrorism Act. Steve Biko was detained in 1976 and detained again in 1977 before they murdered him. The provisions under which he was detained were the Terrorism Act. It contains Section 6, subsection 1. And Section 6, subsection 1 said that no court could inquire into the reasons for the detention of a detainee that was detained under the Terrorism Act. So which meant that they could detain him, keep him in detention for 90 days, interrogate him, assault him, and torture him, and that no judge could enter into the space of the detention. That again was an illustration of how the parliamentary system works. So if we want the Bill of Rights to be protected, it's quite clear to me which system we should be preferring in South Africa. And it's clear that those people that are agitating for parliamentary systems are actually being mischievous. Thank you.
With me, Mbuyisen Ndlozi, and the input we've just received is from Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, and we essentially are having a feature here on the talk, on Power Talk, which we call Political School, in light of the 70 years of the Freedom Charter. And we are asking the question of constitutional supremacy versus parliamentary supremacy. Between now and 1100 hours, I'm going to try and interrogate a little bit of what the advocate has put for us. And then from 1100 hours to 1200 hours, we'll take calls, we'll take inputs from the House. There's lots of lawyers in the House today, and we'll also take people from who are coming through voice notes. I think it's better if you hold this mic from a point of view of audibility. What you did for us, and I thank you deeply, is to basically firstly defend African intellectual integrity. I must say that over the years we do this Freedom Charter thing, and this point is often left on its own, and I think it's mischievous because for some of us who have got left leanings, we leave it because we are scared the ANC might forget, the National Democratic Revolutionary agenda. But it is true. ZK Matthews is important. The second thing you do for us is to go back to the ANC's ideas from 1912. That these ideas don't come when the whites are in the ANC or interacting with the ANC. That actually the integrity of Africa's self-sufficient intellectual thinking. And then you trace the constitutional supremacy ideas for us. What you don't do, which I'd like to ask you to do now, where does this parliamentary supremacy come from? Is it part of the heritage of these ideas as you trace them?
Yes, it is. Look, power was once concentrated in a single institution, whether that was the church. In other words, power in the modern state was once concentrated in a single institution. And that would either be the church or the monarch or the Tsar. Yes. It's the revolutions in England, in America, and in France that forced the dispersal of that power into either two branches or three branches. First, the revolution in England against King Charles with the establishment of the Westminster system. It installed the power, although it did not remove the monarch, it installed the power in Parliament. Right? I mean, that was driven largely by the army. Right? Power was therefore dispersed between Parliament and the monarch. But political power then resided with Parliament. Next, the revolution in France against Louis XIV. That led to the decapitation of the monarch, but then also a dispersal of the power, a total destruction of the monarchy there as an institution or a repository of power, but a division of power then between Parliament as a proxy for the people, because we must always remember Manning, because he's very skeptical about this idea of Parliament as the people. Yeah. Parliament is a proxy for the people, and the executive as basically the agents of Parliament. And then the last revolution, which is probably the most important for our discussion, the American Revolution. Because it's in that revolution that the three branches of government were then established. And you see a lot of those writers in America fiercely defending the third branch, which is the judiciary, fiercely defending the third branch as a co-equal branch, which was the first time that it became co-equal. Although the idea of trias politica is a French idea, it was never practiced in France. It's practiced for the first time in America because Montesquieu was a French philosopher. It's practiced for the first time in America, where they have the three branches of government, which is the Congress, and the president in America is a branch of government, the president and then the judicial. So that's where they come from. They come from Europe.
Missed my question, Advocate.
Yeah.
You traced the ideas
Yes.
of the Freedom Charter, of the Constitution, of the rule of law,
Yeah.
in the African intellectual tradition
Oh, I
of
see.
our struggle.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Is parliamentary supremacy traceable in the same way? So that we sort of located its historicity.
Yes.
ZK advances this point,
Yeah.
the proper memorandum. There are many intellectuals in the legal African intellectual discourse. Who are these Africans? And maybe they were there. Were they there? Did they say something at Freedom
No.
Charter Conference?
No. Thank you. I've now got your point.
Yes.
The answer is no.
I get one.
Yeah.
Okay.
The answer is no. It's not traceable. It's obviously traceable now because it's sort of like fashionable as a political point of mobilization, but it has no basis in African intellectual history.
Therefore, in our struggle.
And therefore in our struggle, yes.
Okay. The second question, and I'm hoping that there's a way in which we can all assist each other. So if there are people in the audience who have a different historical account, you are very free to disagree with the advocate. I promise you that now there are no intelligence reports here at Power. You will not be chucked out. The second thing that I'd like you to expand on is the last point. What precisely is mythical? You sort of give these important examples of people representing themselves, people represented by representatives, ultimately by political parties, and all of that. And then, but originally you had said it's sort of a myth, this thing of parliamentary supremacy. But you gave actual examples of the apartheid state where it's not a myth. The power of parliament over courts keeps Subukwe in prison for those many years in Robben Island. So I'm not sure in what way were you saying it is sort of a myth?
No. I was distinguishing between parliamentary sovereignty, which I say that that is a myth, between it and parliamentary supremacy. Mm-hmm. Parliamentary supremacy is a real thing. Parliament can exercise power. Mm-hmm. They detained Sobukwe, and they can change the constitution, they can remove the judges. That's what they did under apartheid. So I don't think that's a myth, it's a real thing. What is a myth is to talk of, in fact, it's more like perhaps not a myth, but it's a contradiction in terms. Mm-hmm. It's to talk of sovereignty and parliament, because there's no way parliament can ever be sovereign, because sovereignty belongs to the people as a whole.
So the sovereignty you were pointing to was in relation to claims that there could be a situation where parliament is sovereign, and underscoring the first sentence of the Freedom Charter.
Yes.
That the people.
We the people.
Yeah. Now, can you diagnose for us the current parliament? You were beginning to do that. You can leave me out a bit as an example.
Well, I thought you were
beginning to do that, and this is an important diagnosis because there's also conversations about the fact that national dialogue is futile since we have a parliament, that those people have a mandate. But you seem to gravitate to the point that the mandate is a bit more complicated. That's not a direct representation. It is actually complicated by a Republican version of political representation.
No, look, that's a very important point to be, quite frankly. I suppose there are 2 points to be made. The one is that the model that is in the Constitution, right, is a Republican model, right, which is overlaid by a party system. And this is what Arthur Charles Colson was talking about, right? That if you want to know where do these people account, the people that we've elected, go to the party. Right.
They don't account to the people.
Yes, exactly. Directly, exactly. Yeah,
And that's the truth.
That's the truth, yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want to know where they account, go to the people. Now, this was the point that we debated. I acted for an organization called the New Nation Movement in a judgment that came about 5 years ago to ask for a declaration of invalidity of the Electoral Act on the basis that it did not allow independence. Now, there was people coming from outside of political parties to contest elections, yes. But still, despite that victory, even in the last elections, the fact is that the vector of political power is still the political party.
I mean, most recently parties were changing lists.
Yeah.
Obviously, because some of us had to think of different routes.
Yeah.
Nobody, no constituency was consulted.
No.
Who should we replace Mbuyisen with?
Yes.
Or in the case of the ANC, who should we replace Ramaphosa with? When he gets elected as the president, there's a vacancy. The ANC is able to forward someone else. And the question didn't arise.
Yeah.
Such a name didn't even get published for public commentary.
Yes. Yes, I mean, Manin was right that the way the Republican model developed was that it was a struggle of the elites against democracy.
So it was a historic compromise.
Yes, it was a historic compromise.
In which case, I mean, in the US, there are actual constituencies.
Yes.
There's no party between a congressman or woman. People actually vote for the congressman, not for a Democrat.
Yes.
That they don't go and vote party per se.
Yes.
Except that Democrats will limit who gets available in their name in a specific constituency.
Yeah. And in the UK as well, the party is still an important vehicle, but at least there is a constituency model in which you have to be nominated by the constituency.
And in that case, you can be an independent.
Yes, you can be an independent. Yeah. If
So our local state is completely Republican.
Not local, provincial and national.
So the municipal local government elections, since they are constituency based,
No, they are both. Remember,
or there's a party representative
there's a party and a constituency.
and a constituency. But in a sense, the councillors
Yeah.
represent in society
Yeah,
at the moment
exactly.
the most directly
Yeah.
elected, the most representative of
Yeah,
the people.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are now aligned. Yeah.
So what would happen if tomorrow we were to be parliamentary supremacy? Why is that dangerous, since these people come out of a popular election?
It's the constraint of power, because the form of democracy we have right now is a form of checks and balances. The real issue is who's going to check and balance the power of parliament if you have an absolutist system. Because even though we argue, for those of us who are constitutionalists, even though we argue strongly for a rule of law based system in which the judiciary is supreme, the judiciary itself is not outside of constraints. It's constrained by the very same constitution that it enforces. But if the judges misconduct themselves, they can be removed by parliament. So the system checks each other out. But an absolutist parliament system means that a parliament that has no checks and balances.
Let's ask the most basic questions. Why should the judges decide? What about the judges? And oftentimes, until you get to the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, most of the time it's just one person. A listening, a Logish, Alexander, for an example. Just defend for us the idea of, because it has come under some huge challenge. Why? What is it about these individuals that they must decide the interpretation of the law, how long you go to prison for, and who was wrong and right in a dispute?
All right. Look, I agree that,
And not the people.
Yeah. No, look, I agree that you have to ask about the individual, but I think that that approach misses the point of asking about why should the institution of the judiciary decide. But we're going to talk about the individual right now. But let's first talk about why should the institution decide. So the first question is, what are they deciding, right? So most of the time, what they're deciding are enforcement of rights. So in other words, if I go out of power now and I get detained on the basis that what I've been saying here have been subversive, right, to the current government, I've been detained, and the question is, who's going to decide whether I spend the night in prison or whether I go home on bail? So the institution that decides that is usually an independent institution, as opposed to Parliament, right? You could do people's courts, but we don't have people's courts, as opposed to Parliament. So the first feature is independence, which is why the institution of the judiciary must make decisions in which we disagree on legal interpretation and decisions that affect rights. And most of those decisions are detention. You know, when you've been arrested, you want an independent person to decide whether the police are right in detaining you or not. Incidentally, most parliamentarians, if they have been unfairly detained, would not want their own colleagues to decide. They would rather go to an independent person.
A person, Kaucho, what defines this independence? Why are they independent? The courts.
Yes. Well, they are independent because they are not meant to be influenced by political considerations. They are also not meant to be influenced by financial considerations. In other words, you know, often with politicians, especially party politics, you know, they get funded, you know, to pursue particular objects, you know, and it's very difficult for them to pursue objects that are against the funders, you know, and whereas judges are not funded, you know, so they are independent from the funders.
They are not funded. They don't run a campaign to become a judge.
No, they don't. Yes, but they are also. I'm now talking about the second feature, which is sort of personal attributes. But they are also people of good moral standing, people of sound intellectual training, and people of sufficient experience trained in law. Those are the attributes that we look for when we appoint judges, when we recommend judges in the Judicial Services Commission. Now, of course, there will be one or two that do not fit those, but it's the combination of the necessity that the country requires of the institutional independence and the personal integrity of the individual. So we put more stringent requirements in the qualifications of a judge. I wouldn't say that we do for parliamentarians.
Oh, certainly you do.
but it's very stringent to become a judge. It's a tough thing.
And why? And I want you to defend or speak to us about this training question.
Well, I mean, I think on the training front, in order to become a judge, you should have, I mean, of course, there is a minimum qualification of law, you know, but you should know how the legal system works. You should know what a Bill of Rights is. You should know what the presumption of innocence is. You should know what a contract is. How does it differ from a delictual case? Because the public entrusts you to decide something that they themselves couldn't decide. And in order for us to give you a problem, if I'm fighting with my wife and we end up deciding to divorce, the person we go to is a judge. If two doctors are fighting about an experiment that has gone wrong, they go to a judge. If two engineers are fighting about the construction of a bridge, they go to a judge. So you have this role that is so universal in society, where each profession and each sector goes to the judges to make a decision.
Okay. We are still on radio, so there is this small matter of paying the bills. I learned this language when I got here. We're going to go pay the bills and then go straight to the 1100 hours news and then continue the conversation with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. If you've just joined us, this is Power Talk with me, Mbuyisen Ndlozi, on Power 987. Let's go and pay the bills.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyisen Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. Thanks very much. We are still with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, and we are marking the anniversary, 70th anniversary of the Freedom Charter. Both him and I are very much way, way younger than that. But if you can combine our ages, we might be older than the Freedom Charter. But he has given a very interesting input. I'm going to now open for questions. But before we do that, there is somebody amongst us who is older than the Freedom Charter. And I want to start with him, Obaba Omavusum Simang. And when I was in Morogoro, I had a small dinner with President Mbeki. President Mbeki told me an interesting story about you, Chris Hani, himself, and some other two comrades, that you actually shared accommodation in Lusaka, Nanlala on the floor, and you are very, very close, all of you, very, very good friends. I was very shocked because I'm of the generation that contests Mbeki and Chris Hani, that there is an ocean of disagreements between the two of them. And he told us about the story of some guy who used to keep snakes that died terribly. That was made public over a hippopotamus. But 70 years of the Freedom Charter, Babu Mavusom Simang, and the importance of constitutional supremacy, your view.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
In that house in Lusaka outside this thing, you left out the most important one, which was O.R. Tambo. We took turns to do the chores, cooking, sweeping, and cleaning the house. So he too would insist, would try and shoulder him out and say, no, but Chief, this. He says, no, it's my turn today. And he would also wash the dishes.
Nice.
So that's the most important question. Maybe if you allow me, hi everybody, to start off by saying, the people who drew up the Freedom Charter ended up with these words: these freedoms we will fight for, side by side, throughout our lives, until we have won our liberty. That is the pledge that they put forward. I think we should appreciate that they lived up to that commitment. Getting to April 27, 1994, took precisely all of those things. People were involved in this, and it was very broad. The footprint of the ANC, even in these difficult times, remains quite large. But the people were subjected to all sorts of inconveniences as they fought for the Freedom Charter. People would be denied jobs, they would be imprisoned, they would be banned, many things. In the end, of course, there was the ANC was banned, and then people decided to volunteer to fight, in keeping with the commitment that was made at the end when the Freedom Charter was drawn up, that we will pay for this freedom with our lives if need be. I think that's one aspect of the Freedom Charter that, to me, was an unqualified success. The commitment to achieve freedom was realized in 1994. Many people were born much later than that, much later than that. Sometimes look down on the significance of April 1994 because of the difficulties that have been encountered going forward. But that's the most important date, in my opinion, not only in the free South Africa, but in the annals of South Africa.
Okay.
So the Freedom Fighter, I don't know how much you want me to do. So I would give them a really great round of applause. Fortunately, they don't include me. I was just 15 years when they drew this thing up and so on. But also to say one of the achievements was that beyond 1994, 2 years later, the Constitution of South Africa was put in place. Constitution of South Africa 1996 came into effect. This actually was the right terminology, was the consummation, if you will, of the wishes of the Freedom Charter, that the people shall govern and that the rights of the people will be honored. I've heard it, before I stop, I've heard it said that, the Freedom Charter was, done by white people and so on. Listen, the people who drew up the Freedom Charter, apartheid had put us, as you all know, I think that you know, in separate groups. You were Indians or coloreds, that was what it was, Africans and whites. Progressive, democratic people drawn from those groups as patriots, as South Africans, came together and said, we can't continue like this. Let's agree on a charter that will see to the freedom of the people who have been dispossessed and ruled and conquered, all of those things, for over 3 centuries. So some people say, when you say black and white, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That was an assertive statement. We had been given, 87% had been taken by white people of the land. So it wasn't as if, you white people will also be members of the new South Africa. This South Africa, not just 13%, is the country that we are fighting for. And when, I can't resist this one, some people said, but including Indians, merchant class, they used to call them, white people, they are oppressors, is going to dilute the revolution. Oliver Tambo was very upset by that. He used to say, we must then blame our mothers if all the millions of us are going to be subverted by the introduction, by the inclusion of a couple of Indians and white people. And so we must be so inferior that our struggle would really be put back because we included 20 white people and 50 Indians. And so it angered him that was the line of thinking. I think I would just wanted to make that introduction. And of course there were things that the Freedom Charter undertook to perform. They are listed very nicely. We have failed dismally in the implementation of some of those things. We've succeeded in some. Thank you.
So much. I'm going to provoke Sibei. There's a trade unionist these days to say something. If you want to come through, 0861 through our lines, 0861 987 000. And I see that we do have some callers who would like to come in, but Sibei?
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm supposed to be on the panel. I'm sitting here. I'm supposed to be on the panel with Adv Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. And I'm wondering, at what point am I going to come in?
Okay. 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 Let me take Sibei and then I'll come directly to you thereafter. There must be some confusion, but we'll fix it. That's my senior producer. That's my boss who's talking to you now. Yes, Chief.
Briefly, just on the idea of the rule of law, because I think there is idea that people think that idea is very progressive. It was revolutionary if you think about it, to the extent that it emerged out of the beggar state and there was a protection against the feudal lords who, for them, the state was an extension of their personal estate. They were the law, they were the executors of the law, they were basically the judge on the law. So it protected, particularly, if you like, trading people against arbitrary expropriation and so on. But as against, the revolutionary working class today, that idea that basically seeks to entrench the private property regime over the means of production, and of course, against expropriations and all those things and so on, and the social relations that flow from that, it is reactionary. And to suggest, therefore, that it flows from the Freedom Charter, I think is to miss the point. The only way you can understand the Freedom Charter is that it was a battleground of contradictory class aspirations, because it came in the decade which has seen the biggest movement of the oppressed black majority since colonization, right? This was a time of mass struggles. I mean, the Port Elizabeth was brought to a standstill, in the 50s. There were movements in Skukuneland, in Pondoland, of the rural, oppressed people against the culling of cattle, eviction from their lands, all of that. Basically, it was in a period of revolutionary ferment. And that found expression in the charter itself. Because contrary to what people are saying, right, you just have to listen as to what the working class had in mind in terms of what they intended by the charter, by the way. From the record of the proceeding at the Congress of the People, the mover of the clause on the people shall share in the wealth of the land, right? And that's the reason I dispute that you can reconcile this with the bourgeois ideology that actually is constitutionalism and the rule of law and other things. That, the mineral wealth, the banks, and monopoly industries shall be transferred to the common ownership of the people. He says the mover. It, the charter, says the ownership of the mines will be transferred to the people. It is a gold mine. There will no longer be a compound boss. There will be a committee of workers to run the mine. Wherever there is a factory and the workers exploited, we say the workers will take over and run the factories. In other words, the ownership of the factories will come into the hands of the people. Let the banks come back to the people. Let us have the people's committee to run the banks. I
of the
don't.
mover,
It just from the record.
What's the source of what
I
you're
do
reading?
know that the second from the books I read was a delegate of a trade unions in Natal. In seconding the motion, he says, now comrades, the biggest difficulty.
For all our sake, what are you reading? What is the source?
Basically, these are the recordings
The mic.
of the proceedings at the Congress of the People.
And the
that
source?
demonstrate. I read secondary books, usually from Ingaba Yabasebenzi, which was the publication released by what was then called the Marxist Workers' Tendency of the ANC. But the mover, right, the second of the mover, makes a point as well, right, that the biggest difficulty we are facing in South Africa is that one of capitalism in all its oppressive measures versus the ordinary people. The ordinary workers in the country, we found in this country, as the mover of the resolution pointed out, the means of production, the factories, the land, the industries, and everything possible is owned by a small group of people who are the capitalists in this country. They skin the people, they live on the fat of the workers, and make them work. As a matter of fact, in exploitation, this is very important demand of the Freedom Charter now. We would like to see South Africa where industries, the land and the big business and the mines and everything that is owned by a small group of people in this country must be owned by all the people in this country.
Thank
so,
you.
what it shows is that the masses of the working class who are from the crucible of the struggles in the rural areas facing land dispossession, the workers in the mines and the factories, envisaged a far-reaching transformation than, of course, the elite in the ANC, who for them, in the words of Mandela, by the way, 1 year later in 1956, for them, Freedom Charter, even by its nationalization, wanted to break monopolies only so that it create conditions for emergence of a prosperous European bourgeoisie,
Thank you.
which is what BE is about.
Yeah. I don't know how to move in the audience. I need one more hand. Are we going to Baba? Dinama Poske nam apa. We will clarify the panel question during the ad break, so I can apologize at the later stage. Yeah, I've got 2 more minutes before actually a little bit more before the headlines. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think there are a couple of things that need to be clarified about the Freedom Charter. My sense is that you can actually divide it into 3 phases. There's 35 years of mass struggles in South Africa that precedes the Freedom Charter. This is from 1920 up to 1955. It's a 35-year period of intense mass struggles. And if one thinks about the epicenter, of these mass struggles, they would be across the Transkei, in Zululand, and on the South African highveld. I have written extensively, about those struggles and that period. We often refer to it as the mass struggles of the interwar years. Now, there's a reason why, even in academic history, in the historiography, we are unable to reflect on those mass struggles and the ways in which, if they were incorporated into the Freedom Charter, that they were, but they were not. And we can explain why they were not incorporated into the Freedom Charter. And maybe that would answer the question that Advocate Ngcukaitobi is raising, which is that there has always been a suspicion that the Freedom Charter would have been drafted by a few whites. The issue here is that, does it reflect, the cumulative experiences of those mass struggles of the 1920s and 1930s? Such as, in fact, I'm going to mention quite a few of these. But at the center of that movement was the Wellingtonian movement, which lasted from about 1922 up to 1939. In actual fact, that mass movement is disrupted by the onset of the war, the 1939 to 45 war. Now, that movement was quite, it was quite resilient. If you want to think about...
What were its demands? What were its...
Land would have been at the center of
So is there no land in the Freedom Charter?
Land would have been at the center of it, but the ways in which the demand for land was framed was completely different from what the Freedom Charter does with it.
What was the
just
difference?
Just to give people a sense of, some of the highlights of this movement. The Bulhoek massacre.
No, before.
Is an outcome of that.
What was different? What did the Freedom Charter not say about the land, which was a demand of the land movement?
What the Freedom Charter is saying, and that those mass struggles were not about. Those mass struggles recognized the historical reality of conquest. The Freedom Charter does not recognize the historical reality of conquest. That's a reality. That's an established reality that we have today. If we center conquest, as shaping modern South Africa, then we will understand the difference between the land demands that Enoch Mgijima's Ama-Israel were making and what is contained in the Freedom Charter.
What was Enoch Mgijima saying that is not in the Freedom Charter? The Freedom Charter says the land shall be shared amongst all who live in it. What is wrong or what is missing? Who work it? All who work it.
In fact,
what is missing so that we see the difference?
Okay. Let me just explain this. We seem to think that, colonialism was an event, a once-off event. Let me quickly point this out. Because you will understand. Colonialism, in the way it spread across South Africa. It was a patchwork. It was a patchwork of, we do things as we go along. So by 1922, you have a situation where there's land available to African people, but that land is not available to them on paper. In terms of the law, the land that the colonial, administration holds goes beyond what they have occupied, which is why you have this sinister concept of vacant crown land. But vacant crown land is what Israeli would have considered land available to them, and they used it. And for that, a massacre was visited upon them. That's the kind of land struggle that Enoch Mgijima and Israeli were leading. And the reason why the Freedom Charter is not containing that, it is precisely because it extends land ownership and even ownership.
Okay, let's put it this way. What should the Freedom Charter have said to contain that struggle?
The Freedom Charter could...
What should it have said?
That this is, I think to some extent, this is not a kind of conversation, that becomes coherent. I'm trying to bring coherence into the historical struggles that preceded the Freedom Charter.
Unfortunately, we are on radio. Let me take the headlines. Yeah. Think about the framing. Help us. In what way did the Freedom Charter not take into consideration the demands of the masses between 1920 and 1955, which is what you frame as the first 35 years of mass struggle? We're going to take the headlines because I need the advocate to get clearly what the points of disagreements are, and then so that he's fair as well in his response. This is Power Talk, Bantwana Benkosi. We're going to take the headlines with Nyaka Lotefu and get back to the conversation.
Getting you what you need to know. Power Talk, weekdays 9 a.m. to noon on Power 98.7.
Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. I'm going to go right into the callers here. I've got Kifenza Mkari. You've got 30 seconds. Shoot your question, brother.
Thank you very much, Mbuyisen, peace and to you, the advocate, and your audience. I just wanted to go back to your question that you asked, the very first question, whether or not we can draw any historical trajectory in as far as parliamentary supremacy is concerned. And I just wanted to ask the question, when we look at traditional leadership and how it runs the affairs of society, are we able to sort of draw any conclusions around whether or not it is leaning towards parliamentary supremacy or constitutional supremacy? And the second thing quickly, Dr. Mbuyisen, is that I think one of the missing pieces in as far as...
One man, one woman, one question, Kifenze.
Yeah, I just wanted to say...
Can you hear me?
Yes, it's important to speak about the Women's Charter, which precedes the Freedom Charter, so that we don't miss the role of women in this
Thank you.
historical evolution that the advocate has outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question. Loyiso in Cape Town. 30 seconds, brother.
Good afternoon, Doc and advocate. I just want to ask in relation to the power of political parties. Does the advocate think that political parties somewhat limit the power of the president to elect ministers as per the constitution? I'm saying this in light of the GNU, where political parties gave president some instruction to elect who and who to be ministers in order to join the GNU.
Okay.
So I want to know, does he think that limits the constitutional power of governance? Can you comment on the legality of that section?
Thank you. And I've got Advocate Tsidiso Tipanyani from the South African Human Rights Council. Advocate? Commission, rather.
Currently the chair of the South African Institute for Responsive and Accountable Governance. I just want to say, for me, I see the Freedom Charter really as a product of a process in a country's and people's struggles. And we should look at it like that, And I think there's still a need for further discussions, because what was being discussed in 1955, some things have changed, and some things also have not happened. Whether it's issue of land, whether it's issues of international relationships and stuff like that. There's also another clause here which talks about the people of the protectorates Basotho land, Bechuanaland and Swaziland shall be free to decide for themselves. So when we talk about South Africa is our land, and we exclude the fact that, colonization took people's lands, what does this clause mean today? So in 1994, we didn't even discuss, when we were starting a new South Africa, what are the implications of colonization of those people's lands when we talk about land today? So for me, I think there might
You're saying, Advocate, we should have run referendums in Swaziland, Lesotho, and Botswana.
Well, we are saying here that we will allow these people to decide. But now, how do they decide when their lands were taken away by the British and they're now part of South Africa? And we talk about land belonging to the people who live in it. So at some point in time, there should have been some discussion to say, how do you address this situation?
Yeah.
But as I'm saying, for me, it's a process and a continuation. So we still have to talk more about, it's not an end to itself. It's just a process, which is very important. Minus all its flaws.
Yeah. All right, Busi Kamulani of Chaos. Also, a minute. I'm going to propose, because we can continue on YouTube. We don't have to stop when the show ends at 1200 hours. My producer is going to advise so that maybe we can all agree that we just push until 1300 hours so that there's an exhaustive response, because the record at least will be there on YouTube for everybody to see. Busi?
Thank you, Dr. Ndlozi, and thank you, Advocate. I think about how kind of the Freedom Charter goes a step further than what we've gone with the Constitution. And I wonder what are the ways in which we can collectively mobilize, particularly the legal sector, I'm a lawyer, to keep the Freedom Charter alive, or at least the ideals of the Freedom Charter alive. And this is also thinking about how the will of the people, the Constitution should be a reflection of the will of the people. And we shouldn't be afraid to challenge if we feel that these constructions are not a reflection of what we want as a society. And so what are the ways in which we can push things a lot further than what we're going? And I think this question gets lost when we move away from centering the Freedom Charter. Yes, the Constitution draws inspiration from the Charter, but how much further can we go to achieve these ideals? And I think it goes back to the current agitation around whether the Constitution is fulfilling the needs and the desires of this country, or responding in the way that it was supposed to, in mind of the people such as Z.K. Matthews, who had these in mind of the true freedom of the nation. Thanks.
Let's go to Action SA Deputy President, who is also here, Dr. Kekan.
Thank you, Dr.
Very
Ndlozi.
interesting to maybe start off by telling us if Action SA believes in the Freedom Charter.
Thank you, Advocate. No, we can, without reservations, confirm that Action SA supports Freedom Charter, and we believe in Freedom Charter. And above that, we believe in constitutional democracy. It's very painful that you can take a list of the needs which were drafted in Freedom Charter, but there's none that you can tick that has been achieved. The land, the doors of learning, security and comfort, and all those things. We are also sitting here. We have never even enjoyed the fruits of Zondo Commission, which were put out clear on the issue of electoral reform. We are sitting in a country whereby the people who said, we the people shall govern, they don't have any single power of electing a president. A president is elected by 400 people in parliament. Especially now with this arrangement of GNU, we might find a white president very, very soon.
Is that a bad thing?
It is not a bad thing, but it has to reflect the needs of the
I'm
people.
thinking if the president is Carl Niehaus, would you have a problem with him? Is he white?
But we are living in a country whereby majority majority must rule.
I
So
see.
the question that I want to put forward to advocate, it's something which bothers us as Section SA, Section 174 of the Constitution, whereby it gives almost President all the powers to appoint judges. And somewhere, somehow, it promotes parliamentary supremacy in a sense that the president, we cannot deny it. It's a head of a political party. We cannot separate that. So we are seeing Parliament appointing a president, and there's no check and balance around that. So I wanted to check the view of our honorable advocate in terms of the entire 174, because it gives president the entire powers to appoint and disappoint, and it really worries us from that point.
Let me disappoint you then and go back to the advocate. I think my team, Tinyuko, let's check the possibilities of leaving a radio and staying for just another hour in the room on the YouTube platform. Because I do think that we need to get back the questions around the first 35 years and how the mass struggles and their demands did not find expression into the Freedom Charter. But I want you to be overwhelmed in, I think, what that has come. So let's go back to Advocate Ngcukaitobi.
Thank you, Dr. Ndlozi, at least for thinking about my welfare, ensuring that I don't get overwhelmed. I needed someone to do that. I don't know where to start, but I think let's start with the rule of law and the bourgeois question, which is Sebei's point. I don't know if Sebei remembers that he used to organize unorganized workers, I think more than 10 years ago, in the labor court, which I thought was impressive at that stage. So I've seen him recently as a very articulate analyst on television, and I've sort of always been impressed. But those were the days. Look, I think this topic about the connections between the rule of law and the bourgeois, and whether or not the Freedom Charter sort of departed from the sort of pattern of the rule of law that the ANC adopted in 1912. Firstly, we just need to look at the charter itself. I mean, there are, I think, 3 clauses in the charter that totally affirm the importance of law in the courts. So the first one is all national groups shall have equal rights. There shall be equal status in the bodies of the state, in the courts, right, and in the schools for all national groups and races. And then there is a second clause around there. All people shall have equal rights. All national groups shall be protected by law. And then the final one, all apartheid laws and practices shall be set aside. Then you go further, there's another one, all shall be equal before the law. Right? No one shall be imprisoned, deported, or restricted without a fair trial. And the fair trial takes place before a court, which shall have equal status. And the reason for that was because they did not have equal status, because this was the era of parliamentary sovereignty. No one shall be condemned by the order of any government official. Sobukwe was condemned by the order of a government official. You can only be condemned by the order of a judge. The courts shall be representative of the people. In other words, the racial and gender composition shall reflect the people. That's section 175, 174, Dr. Kekan. Right. Imprisonment shall only be for serious crimes against the people and shall aim at re-education, not vengeance, which is what we currently have now in the Criminal Procedure Act. The police force and army shall be open to all on an equal basis, and shall be helpers and protectors of all of the people. All laws which discriminate on the grounds of race, color, and belief shall be repealed. That's section 9 of the Constitution. And then all shall enjoy equal human rights. The law shall guarantee. So, I mean, we can go on and on and on. It's unmistakable that the Freedom Charter is anchored in the rule of law. And it's unmistakable that the Freedom Charter protects the courts, that it wants the courts to be independent, but it wants the courts to be representative of all people. It's unclear to me why people repeatedly spread the myth of the Freedom Charter as a bourgeois document, or, of the rule of law as a bourgeois instrument, yes, that is against the Freedom Charter, and that the Freedom Charter sought to subvert it. The Freedom Charter was an affirmation of a historical commitment of the ANC to the rule of law. The words are there. Now, I haven't read Mr. Sebe's person who spoke at the Freedom Charter, but I've read the text of the Freedom Charter. And the pattern is consistent between 1923, 1943, and 1955. And, you know, when I was a clerk at the Constitutional Court some years ago, when my clerkship ended, I had a discussion with Arthur Chaskelson, whom I was clerking for. I asked him about the freedom. I was younger then, you know, like sort of. I always thought I was revolutionary when I was young. I asked him about the Freedom Charter, you know, and then he laughed and said the Freedom Charter is in the Constitution. But I think that was profound, you know. That was profound. It is, in fact, in the Constitution. The problem is a betrayal of the Constitution by the ruling elite. You know, the ruling elite has betrayed the Freedom Charter, it has betrayed the Constitution. That's the problem we should be debating as society, not an abstract conversation about the differences between the Constitution and the Freedom Charter. Right? They have betrayed it in so many obvious ways. You spoke about the Zondo Commission. This is a clear betrayal of the Freedom Charter. Right? It says the people shall govern, the elites are governing. You know? So we can go on and on about the forms of the betrayal. So we live the Freedom Charter only in rhetorical terms. We don't live it in reality. That's what we should be fighting for, is to implement the Freedom Charter. Now, there is another point about how the Freedom Charter didn't articulate the struggles that came before it.
Let me ask you to, for the sake of our Cape Town listeners and all of that, to start with the traditional leadership and the limits on political parties. Well, the limits on the president to appoint and disappoint.
All right. No, thank you.
And then we can, if you can start doing that as well.
Yes,
so that's just prioritizing that.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'll do that. So let's start then with Dr. Kekana's point, which is the Section 174 of the Constitution. Yes, I mean, the president obviously puts the final stamp on the appointment of the judges, but the president cannot depart. The Constitution uses the word advice. The president cannot depart from the list that he has been given by the Judicial Services Commission. So for all of the High Court appointments, all of the Supreme Court of Appeal, all of the labor, land, competition, he gets a list from the JSC. He must appoint those people in that list. So he says that there has to be an appointing authority, you know, and the president happens to put a stamp, but he really is a rubber stamp. The only time where he has a wiggle room is in the Constitutional Court judges. But even there, he must appoint from the list given to him. So we give him 4 names, he must choose 1 name. But he can't say, I don't like these names, I'll go elsewhere. Where he has complete authority is well, it's not complete because it's limited, because he must do it in consultation, is the appointment of the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Deputy President of the Supreme Court of Appeal. So there he appoints after consultation service commission. So he gives us a list, we interview. What would be interesting is if the JSC said to him, the candidate you've given us is not appointable, to see whether he would still appoint them. But that has not happened yet. So I don't think that power is as big as it is made out to be. It's only that in any system, Someone needs to say, you are appointed, you can earn a salary from now on. And then you also wanted me to talk about the chiefs, traditional authorities. Yeah, traditional authorities are an interesting concept. They are in section 211 and 214 of the Constitution. But here is the real problem, is if you have a wall-to-wall municipal system, a wall-to-wall, there is not a single inch of this country that does not have an elected councillor, wall-to-wall, right? And then you have a provincial system, and then on top of that you have a national system. What is the role then of a traditional leader? Because it's wall to wall, so there is no space in this country that's not covered by a democratic election. What is the role of a traditional leader? This problem has never been satisfactorily resolved, and which is why you've got a vague clause in the Constitution that says that the traditional leaders will be responsible to administer a system of customary law, which is not real democratic power where you make political decisions about development, right? But it then becomes a cultural power where you can make decisions about culture. But again, that's limited because...
What is an example of such a cultural decision?
So for instance,
what to wear in the next festival?
When is the season of initiation
okay.
Among the Xhosa or among the Pedi or any of the communities that practice the system, or what is the number of cattle to be exchanged for lobola? So
let's go to the question of the struggles of the first 35 years.
Now, the only example that has been mentioned there is Mgijima. Yes, and the struggle of the Israelites in 1921.
And we're not speaking about the state of Israel, just clarity there.
No, it's the church, yeah. They call themselves Am Israel, the Israelites, yeah. I mean, when you actually look at the record of that trial, luckily I did a full paper on that, the actual record of the trial. There were three primary factors there that were behind the Israelites. Land was a problem because of the 1913 Native Land Act. But the Spanish influenza was a greater problem. There were a lot of people dying without explanations. And so you had this religious appeal to divine intervention. And then you have the third problem, beyond unexplained deaths, beyond which is now the new policies of Jan Smuts and how they were impacting, quote unquote, on natives. When the trial was held, what the witnesses said was that they wanted a place to pray. They wanted to communicate with God, to bring rain, to chase away evil, etc. And the reason they chose to pray in the vacant space, it was a commonage. They identified a commonage just outside of Queenstown. And the reason they chose that commonage, right, was because it was crown land. And crown land belongs to God. And no one can remove them in a place that belongs to God. And that's why they felt they could resist. They were given instructions to move, but they felt they could resist those instructions because they were communicating with God directly. But their ultimate demand was for more land. It was not for a different form of tenure. It was for more land. The land they had was too little. It was for more land and a space for the church to pray. Now, your question is excellent, by the way, Dr. Ndlozi, to the comrade who spoke, which is, how would that demand be articulated in the Freedom Charter? Speaking for myself, I don't see how it could be articulated better than it was reflected in the Freedom Charter, which is, the land shall be divided among those who work it. if they could show that they work the land, it should be divided among them. And the other point, which again was a problem in Mgijima, is racial restrictions of land, over the land. The Freedom Charter says all of the racial restrictions over the land shall be removed. So it's actually a reflection of that demand. I do really have a problem with, and this is common in South Africa, sort of general statements are made about a document as important as the Freedom Charter, and there is then a vague appeal to history. And when you actually look at the historical material, some of these claims are not borne out, like the claim we've been talking about. Whites wrote the Freedom Charter and they presented it to blacks, and then the black slavishly followed it. But that's just not borne out by anything. So I'm afraid to say that, although I appreciate the point, I don't think the Mgijima example is a good example to illustrate the problem that the Freedom Charter did not reflect the struggles of the preceding 35 years. Thank you. I must now shut up, I think.
That brings us to the end of the show on the part of our radio listeners. And you've been listening to the voice of Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi on Power Talk with me, Mbuyisen Ndlozi, on our feature of Political School, marking 70 years of the Freedom Charter. And we are now going to go to the news with Zwelibanzi Mazibuko. Please stay tuned for Power Lunch with Pabi. From me here, Ndintanda Nonke Makaya.